At a small regional airport, a few civilian aircraft sat quietly on the empty runway. A woman with long brown hair and a slender frame sat in the cockpit of an aging Cessna 172. Young pilots around her laughed dismissively. Flying these toy planes around town? What's the point? Anyone can do that. But during what seemed like just another routine training flight, the radio suddenly cut through the background music with an urgent, deep voice. NORAD to Viper. Return immediately. The entire airport went dead silent, Ed. Reina Vasquez had become invisible in the way that people do when others decide they're not worth noticing. At 33, with long chestnut hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail and a small frame that seemed almost fragile next to the bulky aircraft she worked around, she had mastered the art of blending into the background at Millfield Regional Airport. Her faded jeans and worn leather jacket gave no hint that she had once worn a flight suit worth more than most people's cars, or that she had controlled aircraft capable of breaking the sound barrier. Now she spent her days teaching nervous teenagers and weekend hobbyists how to navigate the skies in single-engine Cessnas that barely reached 10,000 feet. Another exciting day of flying in circles. Jake Morrison, a 22-year-old pilot with barely 100 flight hours, commented to his friends as Reina prepared her aircraft for another training session. I mean, what's she actually teaching them? How to scare birds. The comment drew laughter from the group of young pilots who hung around the airport lounge, their expensive sunglasses and confident swagger marking them as the kind of people who believed that volume equaled expertise. I heard she used to be military, someone else added with a smirk. Probably flew transport planes or something equally boring. Now she's stuck giving lessons to kids who want to play pilot for the weekend. But Reina had long ago stopped caring what people said about her current occupation. She found purpose in the quiet moments, like when 16-year-old Tommy Chen finally mastered a perfect landing after weeks of bounced approaches, or when Maria Santos, a single mother saving for months to afford flying lessons, experienced the pure joy of her first solo flight. Her acts of kindness were small and mostly unnoticed. When Tommy couldn't afford the maintenance on his training aircraft, Reina quietly fixed the engine herself after hours, telling him the next day that the problem had worked itself out. When Maria's lesson money ran short, Reina somehow managed to extend her training schedule without charging extra fees, claiming she needed the practice time anyway. She paid for fuel out of her own pocket more often than anyone knew, especially for students who were struggling financially but possessed the rare combination of natural skill and burning passion that reminded her why she had fallen in love with flying in the first place. The other flight instructors at Millfield treated her with the kind of polite indifference reserved for people who weren't considered competition or threat. They saw a quiet woman who flew small planes and asked no questions about her past, someone who kept to herself and never challenged their assumptions about who belonged in the cockpit of a real aircraft. Hidden in her flight bag, wrapped carefully in an old t-shirt, was a silver patch that she looked at every evening before going to sleep. The fabric was worn at the edges from years of handling, but the embroidered design was still clear. The wings of a fighter pilot surrounding a coiled snake, with the call sign Viper stitched in bold letters beneath it. The patch represented a life that felt like it belonged to someone else now, someone who had commanded respect in briefing rooms, someone whose voice over the radio could coordinate complex military operations, someone who had made split-second decisions that affected national security. But that person was gone, buried beneath years of guilt and the kind of loss that changes the fundamental structure of who you are. As Reina completed her pre-flight check on the aging Cessna, 18-year-old Sarah Kim approached nervously. It was only Sarah's third lesson, and she still gripped the controls like they might explode in her hands. "Miss Vasquez," Sarah said quietly, "yesterday when we were practicing that emergency landing procedure, you told me to trust the wind. How did you know exactly what to say? It felt like you'd been through that situation before, for real." Reina paused in her equipment check, her hands stilling on the aircraft's wing strut, For just a moment, muscle memory took over, and she found herself scanning the horizon the way she once had when every flight could mean the difference between life and death. "Some lessons you can only learn by living them, Sarah," she said finally. "The important thing is that you listened and landed safely," Sarah would later recall. When she said trust the wind, something in her voice made me believe she'd once trusted it with much more than a training flight. There was authority there that went way beyond teaching weekend pilots. It was during Sarah's fourth lesson that everything changed. They were practicing pattern work, the basic rectangular flight path that student pilots use to practice takeoffs and landings. It was routine training on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, with only a few aircraft in the pattern and light winds that made flying conditions nearly perfect. The local radio station was playing softly through the aircraft's communication system, providing background music for their training session. Raina was demonstrating proper crosswind correction techniques when Sarah pointed toward the ground. "Look at those guys," Sarah said, indicating a group of young pilots who had gathered near the fuel pumps to watch their training session. Even from 1,000 feet above the airport, Raina could see their pointing and laughing. Jake Morrison was clearly the ringleader, gesturing dramatically at their Cessna, while his friends gathered around to enjoy the show. "What's so funny about what we're doing?" Sarah asked with genuine confusion. "They think small planes aren't real flying," Raina replied calmly, adjusting their altitude to maintain pattern standards. "Some people measure worth by size and speed rather than skill and purpose. But you're a great instructor. I've learned more in 4 lessons with you than my friend did in 10 lessons with that other guy." "Thank you, Sarah, but remember, we don't fly for other people's approval. We fly because the sky doesn't care about anyone's opinion except the laws of physics." As they turned base leg for another practice landing, Jake Morrison's voice crackled through the radio frequency they were monitoring. He was talking to his friends from his own aircraft, not realizing that his microphone was transmitting to anyone listening on the common frequency. "Look at that," his voice carried clearly through their headsets. "Another thrilling adventure in the mighty Cessna 172. I bet she's never been in anything that goes faster than a bicycle." His friend's laughter was audible in the background. "Seriously, though," Jake continued, "what's the point of pretending to be a pilot when you're just flying around in circles in a trainer? She probably doesn't even know what real aviation looks like." Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "They're being really mean. Don't they know you can hear them?" Raina's expression remained calm, but something flickered in her eyes, a flash of steel that Sarah had never seen before. "Let them talk, Sarah. Sometimes people who talk the loudest know the least." They completed their landing and were taxiing back to the parking area when it happened. Without warning, the radio music stopped. The frequency went completely silent for several seconds. Then a voice came through that made Raina's blood run cold. The transmission was clear, professional, and carried the unmistakable authority of military command. "NORAD to Viper. Return immediately for priority briefing. Acknowledge." Sarah stared at the radio in confusion, then looked at Raina. "Did they just call someone Viper?" Raina's hands had tightened on the aircraft's controls, her knuckles white against the steering yoke. For the first time since Sarah had known her, her instructor looked truly shaken. "Miss Vasquez, they're asking for someone to acknowledge." The radio crackled again. "Viper, this is NORAD command. Priority 1 communication required. Please respond on secure channel." Around the airport, everyone had stopped what they were doing. Ground crews paused in their work. The young pilots near the fuel pump stood with their mouths open. Air traffic control had gone silent, clearly aware that something extraordinary was happening on their frequency. Jake Morrison's voice came through the radio, confused and subdued. Did NORAD just call someone at our airport?" Raina brought their aircraft to a complete stop on the taxiway. Her face had gone pale, and Sarah could see her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the radio controls. "Sarah," Raina said quietly, "I need you to taxi us to the parking area. Can you do that?" "But they're calling for someone named Viper." "I know." Raina's voice was barely above a whisper. "Sarah, please, Just get us parked." As Sarah nervously took control of the aircraft and guided them toward their parking spot, the radio transmitted one final message. "Viper, urgent recall. National security priority. Respond within 30 minutes. Then silence. The airport's atmosphere had completely changed. People were emerging from hangars, gathering in small groups, whispering among themselves. Jake Morrison and his friends had stopped their mocking entirely, looking around with expressions of bewilderment and growing respect. When they finally parked and shut down the engine, Sarah turned to her instructor with wide eyes. "Miss Vasquez, NORAD only calls military pilots. Active duty, high-clearance military pilots. Who is Viper?" Raina sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the radio as if it might provide answers to questions she didn't want to ask. Then she began removing her headset with movements that seemed mechanical, automatic. "Sometimes," she said finally, "the past doesn't stay buried as deeply as we hope it will." She reached into her flight bag and pulled out something Sarah had never seen before. A silver patch with a coiled snake and the word Viper embroidered in bold letters. Sarah's eyes widened as understanding began to dawn. "That's you. You're Viper." The airport mechanic, Mike Rodriguez, would later tell reporters, "I saw her remove her gloves and that patch fell out of her bag. That's when I realized we'd been working alongside someone who used to fly missions we only read about in newspapers." Word spread through Millfield Regional Airport faster than wildfire in dry grass. Within an hour, everyone knew that NORAD had called their quiet flight instructor by a military call sign, and that somehow the woman they dismissed as just a trainer pilot was connected to the highest levels of national defense. Jake Morrison and his group of cocky young pilots had gathered in the airport lounge, their earlier mockery replaced by hushed speculation. "There's no way," Jake kept repeating. "NORAD doesn't just call random flight instructors. This has to be some kind of mistake." But the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Airport manager Bill Chen had quietly made some phone calls, and the information he'd gathered had left him pale and speechless. Now he stood at the window of his office, watching Raina Vasquez sit alone on a bench outside the flight operations building, still holding that silver patch in her hands. The breakthrough came when retired Air Force Colonel Patricia Hayes walked through the airport entrance at 4:30 p.m. Colonel Hayes had been visiting her nephew, who worked as a mechanic at the airport, but she stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the crowd gathered around the flight operations desk. "What's all the commotion?" she asked Bill Chen. "Ma'am, we had a strange radio transmission today. NORAD called someone here using a military call sign, Viper. Our flight instructor, Raina Vasquez, seems to know something about it, but she won't talk." Colonel Hayes' face went white. "Did you say Viper, Raina Vasquez?" "Yes, ma'am. Do you know something about this?" Colonel Hayes looked out the window at Raina, who was still sitting alone on the bench, and her expression shifted from confusion to something approaching awe. "I need to speak with that woman immediately," she said. 10 minutes later, Colonel Hayes was sitting beside Raina on the bench, both women staring out at the small aircraft parked on the tarmac. "Captain Raina Viper Vasquez," Colonel Hayes said quietly. "I wondered what had happened to you." Raina looked up, meeting the colonel's eyes for the first time. "It's just Raina now. I left all that behind." "The hell you did. You can't just stop being the best fighter pilot the Air Force has produced in the last 20 years. You can't just erase the missions you flew, the lives you saved, the records you set." Inside the airport lounge, the crowd had grown larger. Jake Morrison pressed his face against the window, straining to hear the conversation between the two women outside. Colonel Hayes continued, her voice carrying the weight of authority and respect. "You want to know what I know about Viper? I know she single-handedly prevented a terrorist attack on Los Angeles International Airport by intercepting 2 hijacked aircraft and forcing them to land safely. I know she completed 17 consecutive combat missions without a single failure or casualty. I know she set the record for the fastest intercept time in an F-22 Raptor." Raina's voice was barely audible. "I also know that I lost my wingman on the 18th mission. Miguel Santos died because I made a tactical error in judgment. Miguel Santos died because the enemy got lucky with a surface-to-air missile that should never have been able to lock onto an F-22. The investigation cleared you completely. The investigation wasn't there when I watched him go down. Colonel Hayes stood up and faced the airport lounge, where the crowd was clearly watching their conversation. Those people in there spent all day mocking you for flying toy planes and teaching weekend pilots. They have no idea they've been in the presence of a legend. She raised her voice, projecting toward the building. This woman was given the call sign Viper because she could strike with precision and disappear without a trace. She flew missions that are still classified at the highest levels of government. She commanded the respect of every pilot in the Air Force, and when NORAD calls her, it's because they need someone they can trust with national security. Inside the lounge, the silence was deafening. Jake Morrison had stopped pressing against the window and was now sitting in a chair, his face pale with the realization of how completely he had misjudged the woman he'd spent months mocking. Colonel Hayes continued, now speaking directly to Raina, but loud enough for others to hear. You think you're hiding from your past by teaching students in small aircraft, but you're not hiding, you're serving. Every student you teach to fly safely, every life you save through proper instruction, every young person you inspire to pursue aviation, that's all part of the same mission you've always been on. It's not the same, Raina said quietly, isn't it? You're still protecting people. You're still using your skills to make sure others get home safely. The only difference is the size of the aircraft and the scope of the threat. At that moment, the airport's landline phone rang. Bill Chen answered it, his face growing increasingly serious as he listened. When he hung up, he walked outside to where Raina and Colonel Hayes were talking. Ma'am, he said to Raina, that was a representative from NORAD. They said there's been a developing situation involving unauthorized aircraft in restricted airspace, and they need immediate consultation from someone with your specific experience. Raina looked at the phone message Bill handed her, then at Colonel Hayes, then at the crowd of people watching from inside the airport. They're not asking me to fly, she said carefully. They want consultation. Because you're the only person in a 500-mile radius who has the expertise they need, Colonel Hayes replied. Viper, your country is calling. Again. Jake Morrison finally found the courage to step outside. His usual arrogance was completely gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. Ma'am, he said to Raina, I owe you an apology. We all do. We had no idea who you were, what you'd done for this country. Raina looked at the young pilot, seeing in his face the same mixture of ambition and insecurity that she remembered from her early days in military aviation. Jake, the aircraft doesn't make the pilot makes the aircraft. Whether it's an F-22 or a Cessna 172, the principles of good flying are the same. Safety, precision, respect for the machine and the sky. She stood up and looked back at the airport building, at the students and instructors and mechanics who had gathered to witness this revelation. I may have been Viper, she said clearly, but today I'm still just a flight instructor who wants everyone to get home safely. She walked toward the building to return NORAD's call, leaving behind a community that would never look at quiet competence the same way again. If you've ever underestimated someone only to discover they were extraordinary beyond your imagination, type I owe a debt. Raina never told anyone what NORAD wanted during that phone call, but she spent 2 hours in Bill Chen's office, speaking quietly into the phone with people whose names carried security clearances higher than most military personnel would ever achieve. When she finally emerged, she simply returned to her normal routine as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The atmosphere at Millfield Regional Airport shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Jake Morrison, who had led the mockery just days before, now approached Raina with genuine respect, asking if she might have time to review his flight techniques and offer suggestions for improvement. The other young pilots followed his lead, their previous dismissiveness replaced by eager attention whenever she spoke. I've been flying wrong, Jake confided to his friends one afternoon after a lesson with Raina. I thought it was about showing off, about proving how good I was. But she's teaching me that real flying is about precision, about responsibility, about getting everyone home safely. The airport management quietly hung a framed photograph in the operations office. Not a publicity shot, but a candid picture of Raina in her flight instructor clothes, standing beside her aging Cessna with Sarah Kim, both of them smiling after a successful lesson. Beneath it, someone had placed a small plaque. Excellence doesn't always wear a uniform. But perhaps the most significant change was in Raina's students. Word had spread among the local aviation community about their instructor's background, and enrollment in her classes tripled within a month. More importantly, her students began approaching their training with a seriousness and dedication that reflected their understanding of who was teaching them. Sarah Kim, who had witnessed that first NORAD transmission, became Raina's most dedicated student. "I want to learn from someone who's been where I want to go," she told her parents. "Not just someone who can teach me to pass a check ride, but someone who understands what it really means to be a pilot." One evening, as Raina was securing her aircraft after a long day of training flights, she found a handwritten note tucked under the windshield wiper. It was from Tommy Chen, the 16-year-old student whose aircraft maintenance she had quietly subsidized for months. "Miss Vasquez," the note read, "I don't know if the stories people are telling about you are true, but I know you've been the best teacher I could ask for. You didn't just teach me to fly, you taught me to respect flying. Thank you for believing in me even when I couldn't afford to believe in myself." That night, Raina sat alone in her small apartment, holding the worn silver Viper patch in her hands. On her coffee table was a recent photograph of Sarah Kim's first solo flight, the young woman's face glowing with pride and accomplishment. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. "Miguel's mom? It's Raina. Yes, I know it's been too long. I wanted to tell you something. I'm still flying, still teaching others to fly safely. I think Miguel would be proud. Yes, I'm taking care of them. All of them." When she hung up, Raina carefully placed the Viper patch back in its special box. But this time, she also placed Sarah's solo flight photo beside it. "Miguel," she whispered to the empty room, "I found a different way to serve. I'm still protecting people, just one student at a time." Outside her window, the lights of Millfield Regional Airport twinkled in the darkness, and somewhere in that small community of aviators, her students were dreaming of the sky and the lessons their quiet instructor had taught them about flying with honor. Type "I will live kindly" if you believe that true heroes sometimes choose to serve quietly, teaching others to soar. This wasn't just about a radio transmission. This wasn't just about one woman's hidden military service being discovered by a community that had underestimated her for months. This story touches the heart of how we judge others and what we choose to value in the people around us. Raina Vasquez's story is happening right now in communities everywhere, in small towns and big cities, wherever extraordinary people have chosen ordinary lives for reasons that others can't begin to understand. It's playing out in classrooms where retired executives teach high school math, in community centers where former professional athletes coach youth sports, in workshops where skilled craftspeople share their expertise with the next generation. Think about the people in your life who you might be systematically overlooking because they don't fit your mental image of what success or importance looks like. The quiet shop teacher who might be a master craftsperson. The substitute teacher who might have advanced degrees in subjects you've never heard of. The part-time coach who might have competed at Olympic levels. We live in a culture that assumes important people announce their importance. That expertise always comes with credentials displayed on the wall. That legends always look legendary. But real life teaches us something different. Real life teaches us that the most skilled individuals often choose humility over recognition, service over status, teaching over glory. Raina chose to step away from the highest levels of military aviation, not because she couldn't handle the pressure, but because she found meaning in a different kind of service. She understood that forming the next generation of pilots, teaching them to respect the sky and prioritize safety over showmanship, was just as important as any combat mission she had ever flown. The young pilots who mocked her for flying toy planes learned a lesson that extends far beyond aviation. Never judge someone's worth by the size of their current stage. The person teaching weekend hobbyists in a small aircraft might be someone who once commanded fighter jets. The quiet instructor might be someone who once held national security in their hands. Every day you encounter people whose stories would astonish you if you took the time to learn them. The driving instructor who might be a former race car driver. The piano teacher who might be a retired concert performer. The librarian who might speak 7 languages fluently. The challenge is learning to look past the surface, to recognize that choosing a quiet life of service doesn't mean abandoning excellence. It means applying that excellence in ways that might not be immediately visible, but are no less valuable. Tomorrow, when you meet someone who's teaching, training, or helping others in a role that seems modest, remember Viper. Remember that legends can choose to live as everyday educators, that the most skilled hands might belong to the most humble hearts, and that the person whose abilities you underestimate might be someone whom the highest levels of government once trusted with their most critical missions. If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to LN Steelheart Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.